This was something very special because it allowed them to have a status that was not just that of a slave, but as an honored person in the kingdom. But they were very unique individuals. They had to be blemishless, which would have left most of us out, right? They were also male Jewish virgins, which would have left most of the rest of us out, right? They were taken into the palace, were clothed in special ways, were given special quarters, and were given special food. Now, what they were fed was from the king's table. These Jewish men had come from a land in which they lived according to the law of Moses. They did not eat anything sacrificed to idols. They did not do things that would violate their conscience before God. And now they're in a new land, and after all, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So what difference does it make whether they abide by their standards or not? After all, God's not going to be there, is he? He's not going to be an issue because he's back in Jerusalem, isn't he? A territorial God. When I'm away from home, I don't have to do what's right before God. That's not the way Daniel looked at it, though, was it? And apparently, the three brothers with him who came to be known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which, by the way, is their Chaldean name that was given to them. Daniel was told to begin the process of becoming one of these great leaders, these great teachers, these astrologers, if you will, the trained ones. And he says, I don't want to eat the food from the king's table. It doesn't tell us why. Some have said, well, it's because it would violate the law of Moses. I'm not so sure of that. Becoming vegetarian was not demanded under the law of Moses, was it? At least that part of it wasn't. Could it have been that they were going to be eating food sacrificed to idols? Perhaps. But even that wouldn't have necessarily been an issue because he wasn't the one who sacrificed the meat to idols. And we know later in the discussion in the early church that Paul says, don't worry about that part of it. You don't sacrifice them to idols, but that's not an issue. In other words, it just doesn't say. But for whatever reason, Daniel and his three associates say, no, we don't want to eat from the king's table. We want to eat instead vegetables and drink water. Now, you vegetarians out there, this is not a proof that you're right. Just want to make sure that's clear, okay? But they held to their convictions. The eunuch says, listen, it's my head that's on the block here. If when the king comes and sees you and you're not healthy because you haven't been eating from his table, Daniel says, that's okay. Give us 10 days. Feed us the way we want for 10 days and then look and see what you think. And sure enough, when the 10 days were up, they actually looked better, healthier, and even fatter, it says here, than did the ones who were eating from the king's table. I don't like this verse, but that's okay. It's still in my Bible. I still read it, but they were doing well, in other words. Now, was this because God gave them something special at that point? It's entirely possible. We don't know. All I know is that Daniel held to his convictions. He and his three associates held to their convictions, and God blessed it when they did so. When we go 1,000 miles away from home, well, we're not home, so it's okay to do whatever we want, right? There's a lot of people who live that way. A lot of people that think that, well, if I'm not living among my own people who will judge me accordingly, then I can go ahead and do what I want, and then whenever I get back with my people, I'll clean up and live right. People have a tendency to think that they don't have to live correctly before God. However, there's something called a conscience that we have to live with, isn't it? Now, I don't know about you, but when I left, I didn't leave 1,000 miles from home. I went 1,500 miles from home. My family was in Oceanside, California, and I moved to Oklahoma City, Edmond actually, to go to college. Well, that wasn't really that far from home because my dad's family's from Oklahoma. But when I got to college, I had a choice to do what I wanted. I remember when I was working in juvenile treatments or adolescent treatments for psychiatric disorders. Kids that were in trouble at school or in trouble in the communities they were in down the hill from us, 40 miles away. The parents would be excited that they were coming up to the areas that we were living in up there in Ramona in the hill country, east of San Diego. And they would think, wow, now our kids will be safe from that evil city. Is that what happened? I see some heads shaking no. Why? You pick your friends, don't you? And you can pick them no matter where you go. And if you pick bad friends where you are, guess what? the likelihood is you're going to pick bad friends where you go next too. If you don't hold to your convictions. If, on the other hand, you pick good friends where you came from, what's the likelihood that you'll pick good friends where you go next? Somebody said, well, you can get in trouble in college. Yeah, that's true. It's fun, isn't it? College is no holds barred. You can do anything you want, right? Mama and daddy are not there. Your brothers and sisters aren't there. Your friends at church aren't there. It doesn't change anything. You decide what it's going to be like. And when you go there, you choose your own friends, you choose your own activities, and as a result, you tend to live a certain lifestyle. Daniel and his friends went thousands or hundreds of miles away, under duress, in captivity, could have done anything they wanted except for the masters over them, and in fact could have even used the argument, my master made me do this. Haven't we heard that argument before from evil people who've done evil things? Says, I was just following orders. Daniel and his friends says, no, we're not going to follow orders. We're going to do this instead. And God blessed him accordingly. You have the choice to hold to your convictions when you leave home. So I would admonish all of us, but particularly our graduates, that you make your choices based on what's appropriate for you to do. Hold to your convictions no matter how hard it may seem. Now remember, when the eunuch said his head was on the block, Daniel's, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's heads were on the block as well, weren't they? This was not a culture in which they dealt lightly with people who disobeyed. They instead dealt with them harshly. And you're going to see that in a couple of the incidents that occur in Daniel here. But they came back so well nourished, so well able to handle the education they were receiving. And in fact, it says very simply in chapter 1 that they were tested out at 10 times the level that everybody else was tested out at. Now, I was good at testing when I was in school, but I wasn't that good. 10 times better than everybody else? That's a lot. I kind of get the impression God blessed them, especially in that area, but it doesn't say so in Scripture. It just says that they turned out fine. So here was the risk. The risk was to disobey the king, incur his wrath, and as a result, what? Die? That's what the eunuch said would happen to him. So surely that would have been their risk as well, wouldn't it? That doesn't stop there. The king is not a very good king. He's not a very nice guy. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king over all the earth. He rules over virtually everything that you can see. And I don't mean just around their place. I mean you travel 100 miles, you travel 500 miles, you travel 1,000 miles in another direction. Everything you see there is his as well. He's pretty full of himself. But he has this vision, and it disturbs him. He calls his wise men to him and says, interpret my dream for me. And they say, okay, tell us what the dream was, and we'll interpret it for you. Seems reasonable enough, doesn't it? He's an unreasonable man. He says, no, you tell me the dream and interpret it. Nobody can do that on earth. And I think that's the key point here, is nobody on earth can do that. No man can tell you the dream and then interpret it for you. Now, you've got to remember that this is a time period in which the king was the king. If he decided to kill you, that was fine. There were no rules. There were no courts to go back to. There was no appeal. And when he decided you were dead, you were dead. He decides, okay, you guys can't interpret my dream for me, so all of you are going to be killed. Word comes to Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel says, no, wait a minute. I can't interpret that dream either, but God can. So he tells him, don't kill him yet. Let me go to the king. So he took him to the king. King says, can you? He says, no, I can't, but God in heaven can. Wow, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? That's the whole point of it. It's not that it could be done by Daniel when it couldn't be done by others. It was nobody can, but God in heaven can. And then he proceeds to tell him his dream, and then he proceeds to interpret it. And Nebuchadnezzar is impressed. I mean, he is really impressed. You'd think that would have been enough for Nebuchadnezzar. He would never again challenge or in some way, shape, or form put to the test the God of heaven. But Nebuchadnezzar is a man, and he is a man with great power. And what's the old adage? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts what? That seems like a pretty much truism, doesn't it? So Nebuchadnezzar's here in charge. He's got these people. They have shown him already that they are doing God's will. He has even acknowledged that it's God who's doing it. And then he says, okay, that's not good enough. Not good enough? Yeah, not good enough. I'm going to build this huge statue. I'm going to make that statue such that everybody has to worship it. Everybody worships it. And then some guys come around who hate the Jews who say, you know what? There are some guys not worshiping that. How about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They're not bowing down before that image either. And he explodes. Why not? Why are they disrespecting me this way? Because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worshipped God. And they weren't going to worship some other God. It didn't make any difference who it was. It didn't make any difference what the consequence might be. I gave you a question. I'm in college 1,000 miles from home, 1,500, 200, maybe 200,000 miles away from home. Maybe they'll have a college on the moon someday. I don't know. Do I have the right to quit worshiping God? Do I have a right to quit doing what God tells me to do at that point? Do I have the freedom to quit worshiping God? Yeah, I've got that freedom. But it's not right to do so, is it? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't care whether they were in Jerusalem at the temple or whether they were in the plain of Shinar. They were going to worship God. Interesting, in the reading that we just had, let's open up to that in Daniel chapter 3. In the reading we just had, it shows them in their answers to Nebuchadnezzar on that, and as to how they were going to deal with it. He says, you need to bow down before this image. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, starting in verse 16 in chapter 3, says, King, we don't have to bow down to you. That's not what it says in my scripture, but that's what they said, wasn't it? And they said something even worse, though. It says, we don't even need to answer you on this. You tell us to bow down before you, we don't even have to answer that. We don't even have to tell you why we don't. It doesn't matter why we don't. We're going to be disobedient to you anyway. However, so that you may know why, the reason why is because we're not going to worship your gods. We're not going to worship your image. We're not going to worship your statue. We're not going to worship you. We're going to worship God. Now, he waited, well, not long. He waited for the fiery furnace to heat up some more is what he did, right? You can kind of get this feeling that this is a James Bond type of movie where they're finding exotic ways to kill the star. You know, the fiery furnace, the lion's den. Just lop his heads off, right? But no, he was going to show that he was king. So they have this fiery furnace. He has his strongest soldiers take them to the furnace and throw them in. It says they are fully dressed, turbans, robes, fully dressed, and they go into the fire. The fire is so hot that the soldiers that threw them in died. Well, that's pretty hot. I don't know how hot it is. I've opened my oven at home every once in a while, and it's been pretty hot, but I've never had anything quite that hot. Carlos is going up to work on wildfires during the fire season. May have actually experienced something hot like that, but I don't think quite like this. But the point is, Nebuchadnezzar is incensed, and he's going to make sure they learn their lesson. But they held to their convictions. They held to what they believed in. They were so confident. By the way, they didn't stop there, did they? They said, you know, even if God does not save us, we are not going to worship your gods. Now that's conviction, isn't it? See, this is not just to our graduates that this is spoken to. This is to all of us. Even if God does not save, God can save us, but even if he does not, does that impress you or not? I mean, these guys were going to do what was right as they understood it, no matter what the cost was to them. The cost very probably was going to be their lives, and as it turned out, it should have been their lives, but it wasn't. Nebuchadnezzar's looking into the fire, and he says, didn't we put 3 men in there? I see 4. And the 4th one looks like the radiance of a son of God. So he calls out to him by name, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By the way, before this incident occurred, these were favored men in the palace structure. They had been favored by God. They had been favored by Nebuchadnezzar. They had been favored and had been given honor. Maybe that's why he was so upset. He says, after all I've done for you, here you disobey me this way. But it didn't matter. Here he comes. He says, there's 4 men in there. So he calls them out by name. They come out of the furnace. People crowd around about them. The first thing they notice, there's no smoke. No smoke smell. They're not smoking. In fact, they're not smoking. And that's not a proof text against smoking, guys. They're just not burned. Amazing. What had to happen in order for that to occur? Something supernatural, wasn't it? I understand chemistry, I understand physics, just enough to know that you don't go into a fire and be burned and come out with everything being okay. It just doesn't happen that way, unless God happened to them. He recognized that as well. He says, your God sent an angel to protect you. God, your God is the great God, is the God. And then he makes a proclamation of how great God is. The funny thing of it is, Nebuchadnezzar had done that twice before already. I don't understand how an individual who has seen the beauty of God, seen the glory of God the way he has, can forget it so easily and then get caught up doing the other thing. This isn't the last incident with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. This time he tells the dream. Nobody, of course, can interpret it. Daniel is asked to interpret it because Daniel is the one who is known as the one blessed by God to be able to interpret dreams, right? Oh, thanks, God. You're going to have me go before a king who can lock my head off and tell him this dream. He pauses. Nebuchadnezzar says, don't let it trouble you. Tell me what it means. No matter how good or bad the message is, how bad the message is what it was going to be, and he knew that. But he says, you tell me what it means. O king, you are the great king. Everything sustains, you sustain everything around you. But due to your arrogance, God is going to take that away from you. But he's going to do it in a very strange fashion. He's going to take your mind from you so that you live like an animal until you proclaim him as Lord. Then he'll put you back in place as king. You think Daniel was a little nervous about telling King Nebuchadnezzar what that dream meant? Hold to your convictions, but don't just hold to them. Be willing to live by them as well. That's hard, isn't it? I need to speak up sometimes. I don't always know the right words to say, but I need to speak up. I need to say what God has told me I need to say. In the case of Nebuchadnezzar, we have a dream in which God is telling him, you're going to be punished for your arrogance. The incident goes on from there where Nebuchadnezzar says, thank you, thank you, thank you, and he honors Daniel anyway. Daniel says, keep your gifts, and he says, no, that's not the point. You told me what I needed to know. And you'd think that'd be enough. He'd be on his good behavior after that, right? He's walking along the parapets of the palace or something. Man, look at all that I'm responsible for. Look at all I made. Look at how great I am. And God says, time's up. This is what I was talking about. God actually spoke to him at that point. It's a pretty amazing story. And for the next 7 years, he lived in the bottom land of that river system, among the woods, among the jungle, among the animals, with the mind of an animal, until 7 years had gone by, and he looked up at God and said, my Lord and my God. Jehovah then put him back in place where he was king again in Babylon. And he proclaimed the glories of God. I'd like to read just a little bit of that. He tells about this story, and you kind of get the impression he's telling it himself about himself. Let's go to chapter 4, verse 34. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. My sanity was restored. And then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At that time, my sanity was restored, and I was restored to my place. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. That would be enough if that's all we saw, was the humbling of a great man. There are others we could have pointed out and said, God, why didn't you humble so-and-so for too? Nebuchadnezzar had a heart that apparently was willing to be touched. Don't you get that impression as you see these stories unfold? He still did things wrong, but he had a heart that could be touched by God. Sometimes he had to slap him up by the side of the head real hard, but he would respond in kind and appropriateness to God by praising God. He has a son, a descendant named Belshazzar. By the way, the name Daniel was given was Belteshazzar, after the name of their gods. But Belshazzar is the son of the king. It's a little bit different in the spelling there. Belshazzar thinks he's pretty good stuff, pretty hot stuff. And you remember the story of the fingers writing on the wall? That's the story right here in Daniel chapter 5. Nobody can tell him what it means, so finally they remember that there's Daniel who's got the blessing from God to be able to do that. So Daniel's called in, he reads the writing on the wall, and then tells them what it means. Do you think Daniel would have been cautious at this point? By the way, Daniel's an old man already at this point, at least in his 50s, maybe 60s. I'm sorry, I did that for the sake of Aaron over here. The idea that he is a young man now starting his life, no, it still has to be, though, that he gives the message God gives him. And so he says, "You have not humbled yourself, Belshazzar," verse 22 of John Daniel 5. "You have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You took the goblets of the temple, and you used them and drank wine from them, and then you and your people worshipped the gods of gold and silver and of wine and of wood and iron." He says, you didn't know better about that. You knew better than that, but you did it anyway. "You did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand to write this inscription." Now, the inscription was Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. You guys understand that language? Guess what? Belshazzar didn't either. So he interprets it for him. "God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." Belshazzar, however, was honorable, at least in this regard. Somebody could tell him what it meant. He may not have believed what it meant because he honored Daniel, gave him what he promised him would, the fine clothes and the jewelry. But the fact is, he understood now what God had said. And sure enough, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, when he said this day, he meant this day, didn't he? Daniel could not prevaricate, couldn't say, "Hey, wait until tomorrow, I'll tell you what it means tomorrow." Wouldn't that have been an easier thing to do? He did it anyway. He did God's will anyway. Is it easy to do God's will all the time? Sometimes it's very hard, isn't it? But God protected Daniel. And by the way, Darius is probably the Chaldean name for Cyrus. Cyrus is the one who actually, as a Mede-Persian king, came in and took over Babylon, killed Belshazzar that night, and became the ruler in that land. And you got to say, well, this guy doesn't know God, so we can understand why he might have a problem. But that's not really the case. He knew the history, and he knew what was said in the books. He knew about Daniel. In fact, he knew enough about Daniel that he recognized him when the time came for him to punish him. But somehow or another, those who hated the Jews, again, this crops up, doesn't it? Remember when we talked about Esther before? That cropped up there. This is cropped up the second time here, actually. And I forgot to mention that the ones who had accused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into that fiery furnace later. Now notice what's going to happen here. Darius is asked to make a decree that you can't pray to any god other than, and then he names the gods that they worship, and himself, of course. And, of course, Daniel immediately does what? Says he went home, got up into the upper room in his house where he always prayed. And it says he prayed 3 times a day. He opened his windows and prayed toward Jerusalem. Do you think he was afraid of what was going to happen? If he was, he didn't show it. He believed, however, in the God of Jerusalem. He believed, however, in doing what was right, and his conviction said no matter what the decree is. The decree also included punishment, didn't it? You're going to die if you do this. So anyway, we found him, we caught him, and they go and tell the king, and he's outraged. He says, You knew I was going to kill you if you did this, yeah? So why'd you do it? Because it's the right thing to do. So he says, okay, into the lion's den with him. By the way, were these lions hungry? They were hungry, weren't they? The next morning, but the king is upset. He knows Daniel. He's upset and he's worried. He doesn't sleep well that night. He gets up early the next morning, goes out there. Daniel, has your God saved you? I'm here, king. I'm fine. What? That shouldn't happen. So he comes out. And when he comes out, it's amazing again. Here is a different king praising God. And as he does so, he recognizes that the lives that Daniel and his friends had led were the lives that God had asked them to lead. It's an amazing thing. Verse 21, Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel. He shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. In other words, accusing the king of trying to kill him, even though he hadn't violated his relationship with the king. Then, of course, at the king's command, the men who falsely accused Daniel were brought in, and they were thrown into the lion's den, also their wives and their children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions had already caught them and crushed their bones. It wasn't because the lions were full already. It was because God stopped the mouths of the lions. And Daniel was willing to trust God that that would be the case. Not an easy task, is it? You live in this world and say, well, that's in the Old Testament. That's in the Bible. He's just a character in the Bible. Have you ever thought that before? Maybe if I had lived then, I would look at things differently. No, it doesn't work that way, does it? Daniel was a person just like you and I are. He was a man just like you and I. Job was a man just like you and I. We are human beings. They are human beings. The struggles of their life were really no different than the struggles of ours. Ours actually may be a little bit easier. Maybe even a lot easier. But that doesn't make it any different or any better. It's just our choice whether we're going to hold to our convictions, maintain our faith, live according to the way our faith tells us to live, or not. That's really all it's about. And so praising God is one thing, but praising God and living, even if, and I like the way Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego put it, O king, even if God does not save us, we're not going to worship your gods. That's the way we should live our lives, shouldn't it? Even if God does not save us, even if God does not give us special blessings here, I'm not going to do wrong to violate my relationship with him. So the admonition to our graduates, to our retirees, to all of us really, is to maintain our faith and hold fast to it no matter what the challenge.